Meantime, health authorities in Bali are monitoring 11 people hospitalised with possible symptoms of the COVID-19 virus in the wake of yesterday's death of a British woman. For all the latest, I'm joined by our Indonesia correspondent Anne Barker. And just how damaging is the way they've handled the first death in Bali?
Bev, look, it's raised a lot of questions about transparency and confidence in the way that the Indonesian government has handled the testing and even the publicity around the cases that have been confirmed in Indonesia this week. We heard from the Bali provincial government yesterday that they had not been told, for example, that a British woman who had died earlier yesterday morning was in fact positive for the coronavirus. The government had told the media the day before that there were 27 cases. They named case number 25 as a patient, a woman who was 53 years old, but there was no detail of who she was, where she was from and where she was being treated. It turns out that the government claims they told the doctors in Bali that she had coronavirus as soon as the tests in Jakarta came back, but didn't tell the government of Bali. Of course, it's the government you expect that would need to act to isolate people that had contact with this woman, if indeed they knew that she had coronavirus. There are a lot of questions also about the fact that the government won't reveal where the 30 cases now that are confirmed with the COVID-19 virus, where they are in Indonesia. There is a lot of suspicion that they're in Bali, some of them. There's clearly one cluster in Jakarta that we know of, but everybody else, we have no idea which cities, which regions. And that, of course, raises questions of public interest. Two health officials are questioning why the government won't reveal these details so that people can make up their own minds whether they want to travel to places like Bali or elsewhere. So there are a lot of questions about transparency and, of course, the public interest, whether it's being met.
Of course, Bali, as we know, is almost totally dependent on tourism. Is that part of the reluctance to sort of properly declare this in terms of the public domain?
Well, certainly no one's admitting that, but that is the suspicion, that Bali is the jewel in Indonesia's tourism crown. There were something like 5 million tourists who went there last year. Australians make up about 1.2 million of those. China is not far behind. So certainly there's been a drop in tourism, for example, this last month or two of about 40%. Tens of thousands of people are cancelling their holidays. Obviously the tourism industry in Bali, which delivers so much revenue to Indonesia overall, is being hit, and hit very badly. There was even a suggestion today that there is a possibility that Bali might be locked down if the situation worsened, if there were more cases. So people are suspicious that that's what this is about. This is why the government doesn't want to reveal that perhaps there are more people in Bali with coronavirus, but only time will tell whether that is the case.
And how available is testing for people in Indonesia?
Well, until 2 weeks ago, until early this month, in fact, it still was the case that less than 200 tests had been done in the whole country of 265 million people. There were a lot of questions for weeks about why the government wasn't testing far more people, particularly when you see countries like South Korea and Singapore that have tested so many thousands of people and seem to have a much better control on trying to contain the virus. We now know that there's something like 600 to 700 people that are being tested. It is definitely happening more widely, although Bali, the hospitals in Bali don't have the kits that allow them to do the tests properly and quickly. They still have to send samples to Jakarta, and that's the case for a lot of provinces. So there are still a lot of questions also around that testing.
And the Dutch king has still opted to travel to Indonesia. How significant are some of the statements he's been making around the independence struggle of the 40s?
That's right. King Willem-Alexander and the Queen of the Netherlands have been on a state visit to Indonesia this week. They leave tomorrow after 4 days. They're not the first royals from the Netherlands to come to Indonesia, but this is the first time that a monarch from the Netherlands has actually apologised for the Dutch aggression towards Indonesia in the 4 years after World War II. Remember, of course, that the Dutch were the colonial power in Indonesia for something like 350 years. They tried to hold on to Indonesia in those years after World War II. Indonesia proclaimed independence in 1945. So this was the first time that a monarch has apologised for the aggression that happened. Of course, there were atrocities on both sides. Many people killed on both sides before the Dutch finally relinquished Indonesia. It's significant in that sense, but of course Dutch governments previously have made many statements on this kind of aggression. There has even been compensation paid in the past by the Dutch government towards some of the families of victims who died in those years. And importantly, there is still a lot of court cases going on in The Hague in the Netherlands where families of many victims are trying to claim compensation, trying to get some sort of admission from the Dutch that they were tortured or abused and so on. So the King's admission this week is only one part of a much bigger story.
And Baka in Jakarta, thanks for your time.